Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we've got a truly fascinating topic to unpack for you. We're going to take a very objective, clinical look at an incredible collision between an individual and a massive institutional system. But here's the catch. We aren't going to view this through a political lens or a purely legal one. Instead, we're going to use the analytical framework of social psychology. We want to understand exactly how human minds, both on their own and inside a group setting, arrive at some genuinely extraordinary decisions. Okay, let's dive into this stark reality. Picture this. A man named Dr. Chen is arrested by the police right inside his own home. And the final verdict? 1 year and 8 months in prison for the crime of picking quarrels and provoking trouble. But what did he actually do? The underlying action that led to this massive sentence was simply sharing and retweeting posts on the internet. And the wild part is, many of these weren't even his original thoughts. Surprisingly, some of the content had already been published in official media channels. So, the natural question here is just why? How in the world does an institutional system justify an outcome like that? How do the individual people working inside a legal system mentally process information to hand down such a severe punishment for what basically looks like a totally mundane, everyday digital action? To figure this out, we have to strip away all our normal assumptions and look strictly at the psychological gears turning behind the scenes. Because, spoiler alert, these are the exact same mechanisms that affect all of us every single day. To do that, we're going to use a micro to macro framework today. We'll start with the specific facts of the case, look at individual cognitive biases, check out group conformity and system justification, talk about minority influence, and finally zoom all the way out to the societal spiral of silence. All right, let's get into Section 1, the case of Dr. Chen, just setting our baseline of facts here. I really want you to focus on this number, 100. Dr. Chen was an independent scholar, okay? He wasn't some massive social media influencer with millions of fans. He literally had fewer than 100 followers. And over 2 decades, 20 whole years, his lifetime retweets across all his platforms totaled under 100. So from a purely data-driven standpoint, his post presented zero algorithmic virality. Absolutely none. There was no huge audience, no massive cascading social effect, and yet the system looked at him and perceived a severe, immediate threat. So where is that massive disconnect coming from? That brings us to Section 2, individual cognitive biases. Let's look at the mental shortcuts happening on a micro level. The first concept we really need to grasp here is the fundamental attribution error. This is a classic psychological trap. It's when we assume someone's actions are driven entirely by their internal personality or, some hidden malicious intent, while completely ignoring the situation they are actually in. In this case, the system looked at Dr. Chen's high level of education and immediately jumped to the conclusion that he had a deep, malicious intent behind his retweets. They basically assumed, well, he's highly educated, so he must have known better, meaning he intended to attack the system. They entirely ignored his actual situational context, that he was an academic whose literal job is to explore, archive, and question complex ideas. And this brilliantly illustrates the clash of two entirely different cognitive processing systems. The people inside the judicial system were relying heavily on System 1 thinking. That is your fast, shortcut-driven, risk-averse brain that heavily relies on labels. If a post triggered a sensitive label, boom, System 1 quickly categorizes it as a threat. Dr. Chen, on the other hand, was operating on System 2 thinking. That is slow, highly analytical, embraces complexity, and is deeply grounded in academic skepticism. The real tragedy here is that these two systems simply cannot translate to one another. The institution's fast, rigid processing fundamentally misread Dr. Chen's deep, complex processing. They literally interpreted his academic nuance as direct defiance. Let's zoom out just a bit for Section 3, group conformity and authority. This is where we run into groupthink. We've all felt that pressure to just agree with the room so things don't get awkward, right? Well, inside a judicial system, the pressure to maintain internal consistency and harmony is absolutely immense. The famous Solomon Asch conformity experiments from the 1950s prove that individuals will frequently ignore their own objective reality just to agree with the majority of a group. If the prevailing narrative inside a legal team leans toward a guilty verdict to keep the institution stable, individual actors will naturally suppress any dissenting viewpoints or doubts. In these situations, consensus simply becomes way more important than critical evaluation. And to maintain that consensus, individuals rely on what psychologists call moral disengagement. This is how perfectly normal people manage to bypass their own moral culpability. First, they ignore evidence, like completely dismissing the fact that Dr. Chen's posts had essentially zero reach. Second, obedience to superiors. They act primarily because an order came down from above. And third, responsibility transfer. This is the psychological comfort blanket of saying, hey, I'm just doing my job, or I'm just following the law. By doing this, the individual shifts the heavy moral weight of a severe punishment entirely off their own shoulders and onto the collective structure. This entire dynamic is perfectly, and I mean perfectly, captured in a quote from the prosecutor in this very case. They said, "There are special instructions from upper-level leadership. This must be made an ironclad case." This explicitly links right back to Stanley Milgram's classic obedience experiments. Milgram showed us that ordinary people will blindly follow the instructions of an authority figure, even if it causes severe harm to someone else, because they mentally hand over their personal responsibility to that authority. So this ironclad case wasn't necessarily built on ironclad facts, it was built on ironclad obedience. Moving right along to Section 4, Labeling and System Justification. A critical mechanism at play here is de-individuation. When a powerful institution slaps a label like criminal or troublemaker onto someone, a profound psychological shift happens. That label strips away the person's humanity, their personal history, and in Dr. Chen's case, his entire identity as a rational, thoughtful scholar. Once that label sticks, the people inside the institution no longer see a complex human being. They just see a designated threat. And obviously, that makes it incredibly easy to apply severe, punishing measures without feeling a shred of individual guilt or empathy. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the crucial distinction between a symbolic threat and a realistic threat. A realistic threat is physical, right? It's a clear danger to safety or actual resources. A symbolic threat, though, is purely ideological. It's just a challenge to a worldview or a set of beliefs. The massive psychological error the institution made here was completely conflating the two. The system treated Dr. Chen's symbolic academic questioning as if it were a realistic physical danger that required an immediate, harsh, neutralizing strike. All right, let's flip the script and look at Section 5, Minority Influence and Resistance. So, having looked at the absolute overwhelming psychological force of the institution, how does one isolated individual even begin to push back? Dr. Chen's response is honestly a textbook example of psychological resistance. First, he flat out refused the labels assigned to him. He constantly shifted the argument away from his supposed personal intent and pointed back to the structural complexity of how information is shared. But most importantly, he maintained absolute consistency in his logic. He was even writing his defense from inside prison, aiming it not at his current captors, but at a future audience. So the crucial point is directly connected to Serge Moscovici's theory of minority influence. This theory states that a minority of even one single person, if they remain rational, confident, and unwaveringly consistent, can eventually alter the worldview of the majority over time. Dr. Chen knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing a long psychological game. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 6, the Spiral of Silence, where we look at the macro societal impact. We are now zooming all the way out to observe the ultimate fallout of a case like this. The theory of the spiral of silence suggests that when people see a minority opinion being punished, they will instinctively hide their own similar views out of a deep fear of social isolation, or in this case, severe legal retribution. I mean, think about it. How often have you typed out a tweet or a comment and then just deleted the draft because you were worried about the backlash? By administering such a severe punishment for incredibly low-impact retweets, the system sends a glaringly bright signal to the broader public: absolutely any deviation from the consensus, no matter how small or academic, is highly, highly dangerous. Let's move to and see how this builds into a dangerous chain reaction across all of society. Step 1. You have the highly visible institutional punishment of a single individual. This immediately triggers Step 2, public fear. The observers out there internalize that risk. That leads straight to Step 3, self-censorship, where people proactively police their own speech and their own thoughts just to stay safe, which finally culminates in Step 4, a sweeping societal silence. What started out as a micro-level cognitive bias inside a single courtroom eventually expands to chill the intellectual vitality of an entire society. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought. We've seen all the mechanics today, right? We've seen how heuristics, groupthink, authority obedience, and labeling all work together to neutralize a perceived threat. But as we look at the stark psychological reality of the spiral of silence, we really have to ask ourselves, can a society actually maintain true stability, innovation, and vitality if psychological fear is systematically silencing its minority voices? It is a heavy question, but it shows just how deeply social psychology impacts our real world. I really hope this explainer has left you eager to explore even more of these fascinating psychological structures. Thanks for joining me.